iCloud. Recording. Okay, well, hi everyone. I can see that you were, everyone's saying hi, that's on. I can see that you were able to watch us in the introduction phase, which is not usually how I want it to be set up, but I'm learning how to use Zoom, so I apologize for that. I'm here with Nicole Sierra-Rolet and Daniela, which you guys remember from last week. Daniela is my tasting coach first and foremost, and has completed the Wine and Spirits Education Trust Diploma with honors, might I add, and has a private cellar and shopping company called Domaine. And then we have Nicole Sierra-Rolet from Chêne Bleu. So Chêne Bleu is a winery that Onivino proudly represents. I think we've been together for maybe three, 4 years now at this point. So it's very lovely for you to take the time to join us during this very mystical period in the world. And yeah, so why don't you get us started with a little bit of your philosophy of the Domaine and some of the history, please.
Thank you, Alexandra, and congratulations to the two of you for having such a fantastic wine company. I think it's a privilege to work with young, dynamic people who are really passionate about what they do and full of ideas and full of energy. And it is such a beautiful, virtuous circle. And as you'll see, we have been able to get this whole project off the ground thanks very much to the very collaborative spirit that we have with our partners, with our clients, and hopefully the whole will turn out to be greater than the sum of the parts. So that's certainly what attracted me to this project. You may know that we're very far in the south of France. So we are, yes, in Provence. However, you may also know that the wine map in Provence doesn't always match with the district or department map. So in fact, a big piece of the road, sorry that it's backward, I'm also learning to use Zoom, is jutting out into Provence. And we are not far from Avignon, not far from Châteauneuf-du-Pape, way up in the mountains above Gigondas. So this map doesn't show you one of the crucial aspects of why we got so excited about this terroir, this opportunity to make wines in a very particular place. So if you've been to these areas like Châteauneuf, you'll know that there's the riverbed with the famous river stones. And then as you go up the mountain past Gigondas, you get to these higher reaches, which are very different because they'll have snow when the others will have rain. We'll harvest in October instead of September. So we're actually up at about between 550 and 600 plus feet, meters, which is 1,800 feet or so. And everything is very distinctive there. And that is one of the reasons that attracted my husband to the property, because he found it when it was a complete ruin. It was a little weathered picture in the window of a real estate broker, and it was a 9th century priory which had been completely abandoned. No water, no electricity, nothing but a big fig tree growing through to the sky. And it took us a really long time to fix it up. That's the same place today. We really tried to respect all the ancient history of this very special site. But that is the convergence of history, of very particular geology, very particular altitude, and very extreme isolation, all by ourselves up here. So I hope you can see in our picture here, the property, the rolling hills, and that's a little blue oak tree over there, which is the symbol for the winery and for the fact that it's a place that wants to respect all that history, but also bring a modern, edgy way of solving for things. And when I met my husband, little did he know, little did I know, that I would end up becoming the crazy deranged wine person, joining his family and embarking on this big adventure with them. And now I'm completely obsessed, and it's been the passion of my life for the last 15 years.
That's incredible. Nicole, so you promote a lot of wines at saying it's a bit spoken and it's haute couture, right? As philosophy of the house. Could you please explain us what haute couture means? Because if I take the knowledge that I have for fashion will be a particular, best qualities, a unique style, very hard to copy. Can you just explain us this? How does this reflect in your wines?
Yes, thank you for mentioning that, because it's very difficult to encapsulate in a few words the whole philosophy of pulling together a medieval vineyard and working in complete anonymity for the first 12 years of that before you even produce your own wines, and putting so much thought and care. How do you explain what you're really trying to do? So the notion of haute couture for us is to reflect first and foremost the craftsmanship that we put into this. So I'll explain a little better. I know we wanted to talk a bit about viticulture today, and I think that's crucial because now you hear about sustainability as being one of these big buzzwords that everyone's talking about. When we started, that was the whole draw of this place. My husband is very much a conservationist. I was from Manhattan. I didn't know anything about how to manage an entire biodiversity ecosystem, and he was drawn to the place 25 years ago for that very reason. So in the vineyard, the notion of haute couture for me is to be incredibly attentive with hand-tailored work to take on every single plant one by one. They were each and every one was in terrible shape because it was a very, very old vineyard with very old vines. But we do everything by hand. This is my sister-in-law, Benedict, who's absolutely extraordinary. And we repicketed the entire vineyard. We had to take out the original pickets. We put in this special system to manage the canopy better. And each one of the vines of all 30 hectares was pruned again, brought back to a completely different shape. It was an enormous amount of work. So for me, this is very much what you would expect to find at a tailor in St. James, Jermyn Street in London, or a place like this. It's not at all one size fits all approach to viticulture. And that allows us to work really on a vine by vine basis to figure out the best way to get the expression out of each one of those plants. And she is just extraordinary with her patience and tenacity in doing that. So then, as you may see in this picture, we use these very small crates that are stackable. You may have seen them before in a couple of big chateaus, but they're very unusual to be used in our area because most people harvest by machine. Mm-hmm. And if you do harvest by hand, many people will just throw the clumps of grapes into the buckets, and inevitably the compression of the grapes building up will start premature oxidation. By using these crates where you only do one row of clusters, you allow the grapes to come in intact into the winery. And so then you don't have to spend any time or use any common products to prevent this premature oxidation in the winery. You keep everything in a really, really airtight environment, and that allows you to work in the winery without having to use a bunch of chemicals.
And I think that's very important, especially with Grenache, because you work a lot with that, and it has this very thin skin, and it's prone to oxidation as well. So you're protecting the grape from the vine itself.
Absolutely essential. Yes, we think it helps a lot. We also have the fact that we harvest much later than our neighbors. So we're harvesting in October instead of September. And as a result, it's much cooler. The grapes come into the winery because we have such a long, protracted growing season. in cool conditions, so we don't have the problem of having to rush the grapes in or have a lot of the, have to refrigerate everything. It's really quite ideal conditions from that point of view. There are also problems. In the mountains, you're going to have a lot of weather risk. You're going to have sometimes, by having the later harvests, already some weather movements that are not the same as the people who will already have brought their harvest in. So you end up with grapes that are kind of marching to their own drummer, that don't fit neatly into all the reports that you see about different regions and how the harvest was, etc. They're always kind of doing their own thing. And that was very hard for us at the beginning, and also very exciting to have to go our own way and find our own path and deconstruct that vineyard and rebuild it on the logic of what we were seeing in, amongst the vines, and not look across the road, down the valley to see what other people were doing. So you end up being a bit of an adventurer, a pioneer, and it attracts a certain kind of person who likes to step off the beaten path.
Yeah, it's risk on risk on risk. I mean, having been there, I can see, I recall all of the marvel of it, and I've visited a lot of vineyards. I'm very blessed, and I've actually never seen what I saw there. Just the energy and the feel and the love and the care and I mean, I think you thought out every square inch of your procedure. We can hear it in I think there's nothing that you can't explain fully, which is marvelous.
I think it forces you, right, to rethink everything. You can't just follow the pack because it doesn't apply to you, and so you just have to. It's like having a child that has a very distinctive personality, or maybe some special needs or something like that. You have to be incredibly tuned in to them to really tailor make your parenting to their needs, and you can't just follow the mass. So if you look at the geology of it, look where we are here. This is actually the edge of the tectonic plate of the bottom of Europe smashing into the top of Africa, and by pushing the plate on the side, it has an enormous bearing on the style of the grapes, because as I showed you when we were looking at the cross sections here, by having the Jurassic, Triassic, Cretaceous, having the edge of the plate exposed, there are very few vineyards in the world growing like that on the side of a plate. In fact, one of the more well-known ones is actually named Ridge. I'm sure you're familiar with that wonderful American one, because it's also on a tectonic ridge. So, the geology is going to bring a certain kind of seasoning, shall we say, to the wines. The latitude is going to bring a lovely, rich fruit. We get nice maturity, nice sugars, and we don't have a problem usually with maturity, except on our Mourvèdre, because that's a late ripening grape and it's temperamental at altitude. And then we have these much cooler temperatures that mean that we're able to retain a lot of the natural freshness there. And that freshness in turn has two advantages. First of all, in our opinion, it really offsets a lot of the saturation of the flavor concentration that you often get in a hot place. And second, it contributes very significantly to the ageability of the wine. You don't have to use tartaric acid or other things to make the wines taste bright and fresh. And even for the rosé, which is one of our hallmarks, you don't need to use any of these things, which means that the molecular integrity of the wine stays for a very long time, and they don't start to fall apart. It's not a classic rosé where the next year you have to throw it down the drain because it's oxidized or whatever. So it brings some really good advantages there. I won't lie to you, there are some real problems. Tiny yields. It's very uneconomical to make wine with small yields, even more than I realized when I studied at UC Davis. They did warn us, but I didn't understand the economics of vineyards fully enough to understand how low yields are very, very difficult to manage. It also, apart from the weather risk that we manage, you should do everything by hand. And in this day and age, that is a big imposition, again, on your cost structure. We wouldn't trade that for anything. We think it's an essential aspect of what we do, but it's not for the faint of heart. What you do see is more and more people coming to this area, the upper reaches of the Ventoux, who are willing to put in the sweat equity to turn these ancient properties around. And I'm very excited about the future of the region, because I think that with all these international and French people now rediscovering these incredible properties, the future is very exciting. I think you'll see lots of very dynamic wines coming out of here. And when you talk about energy fields, a lot of people feel that when you're near the edge of a tectonic plate, a ley line, there are very particular energy fields that are unusual and hard to replicate elsewhere. And I'm from Manhattan. I don't know much about these kinds of things, but I can tell you that it's rare that someone won't feel a very specific, intense energy when they come up to the mountain where we are.
Going back on that same energy subject, Chêne Bleu, it's very much into sustainability, right? In the vineyard, in the cellar. I know there's a particular water management program, and you're using a lot of bees. Can you please explain us how are you integrating all that? Because I know I think you're biodynamic in some parts, and then organic. Just what would be the general aspect of it?
I'm so happy that these questions are coming up now more and more in the fine wine world, because it was fascinating to me that it took as long as it did to start to steer the juggernaut of the international wine world back in the direction of nature and of the vineyard, after a couple of decades of love affair with chemicals. And now I think the long-term side effects of those decades are being felt, not just by the consumers, by the planet, but by the individual vignerons as well. So I think you'll see hopefully more and more return to natural forms of agriculture. So we inherited this incredible vineyard. When I say inherited, when we bought it, but it had been in a family for many generations, and then it was stuck in an inheritance feud and was on the market for a very long time and kind of abandoned and left to its own devices, because nobody wanted to put in the beastly work that was going to be involved in fixing it up. And so,
years, just for our viewers, I think that was what, 10, 15 years you put in?
Yeah, even longer. My husband found it right before we met. This was in the early 90s. Okay. And he couldn't understand why it might have, such a fantastic configuration of things. Part of his family is in the wine business in the Jura. They have a wonderful winery there, Domaine that you may have heard of. And it had always been his dream, but he didn't have the capital. His family was in the military, and so he had to go into other professions to gather the capital that he needed to pursue his dream. And as soon as he had it, he started to shop around in the classic areas, and for his modest budget, was looking at a couple of hectares in Châteauneuf or in Burgundy, and then suddenly this place, 30 hectares and a medieval priory, it seemed too good to be true. And in some regards it was, 12 years to fix up one vineyard is not for everyone. But to your point, the wonderful thing that had happened is that nature had really taken over, and you had a place that was pullulating with animals. I mean, it's like a natural amphitheater. You stand there and you look around you, and you have the fabulous Dentelles de Montmirail that you may have heard of. They're part of the Mont Ventoux region, and the Mont Ventoux being the giant of Provence, that famous mountain that I showed you briefly earlier. And the Dentelles, which you can see here, this is the crest of the Saint-Amand, and you're just surrounded by these rolling hills and no neighbors. And as a result, it's a paradise for animals and you can see as details in the label. This is the middle of our wine label. You'll see many of the animals represented that we can see at the property. So with that in mind, it would have been criminal to start bringing in chemicals and destroying this wonderful ecosystem. So from the start, we started doing everything we could to reinforce that ecosystem. And that's why today we end up with this seamless integration between the vineyard and the forest. And you can see the natural bees nests and the vines. You can see this bamboo forest that we planted to filter the waters from the winery. We brought back sheep. We have a young shepherd. And then there's an interesting picture down at the bottom where you see these spontaneous beehives showing up attached to the vines. So we have at the Mont Ventoux 1,200 species just of butterflies. I hope that gives you a sense of the extravagant biodiversity. So
but
now
that's why it's also UNESCO, right? Where you are, you're on the reserve.
Exactly, you're absolutely right. It's a UNESCO biosphere, and UNESCO, as you probably know, has identified places in the world that have unique fauna and flora, not just for the species the abundance, but also things that you could not find anywhere else. So we work with those scientists in a public-private partnership. We also have done studies with the Université d'Avignon, and most recently, we've started a program called Sustainability, BEE, because we're convinced that by bringing in more bees, you can make better wine. And you might wonder what the connection between bees and wine is, because bees typically are not needed by vines which are self-pollinating. But actually, if you want to stop chemicals and you bring in these bees, they will help you turbocharge the planting of your cover crops. 80 to 90% of those cover crops are cross-pollinating and need bees. And so you quickly bring in your cover crops. Those crops in turn develop a habitat for your microbiome. Your microbiome, of course, nowadays, again, the last 5 years or so, everybody understanding with big data the value of microbiome is what's going to help you to keep living healthy soils without having to till, without having to add all sorts of special fertilizers that are chemically based, etc., which in turn are not just going to contribute to the health of your vine, but also, and I think this is really an exciting piece of the puzzle, they're going to be transmitting the sense of place, because as you know, the microbiome are now considered responsible for transforming the soils into the sort of bite-sized nutrients that the plants need in order to thrive. So without a living microbiome, you greatly reduce your ability to transform your sense of place, which of course is one of the great definitions of a fine wine.
Can I ask how you came about this very particular discovery?
So it was slightly empirically based. So my husband was a passionate beekeeper. He was helping a neighbor of his growing up in Salon-de-Provence when he was a teenager to keep his bees. And again, always promised himself that the minute he could be in the countryside, he would try to have some beehives. And so he brought them in from the beginning, and we saw a remarkable effect of them. And so when we were preparing this crowdfunding at the end of last year, we thought it would be very valuable to create a scientific study to get these incredible specialists who all know so much about the various pieces of that puzzle to work together as a team and create a chain of knowledge so that we could sew together these disconnected pieces into a roadmap for other winemakers who also want to stop using chemicals.
Yeah, you're incredible. it's always impressive to talk to you. I have a few questions that kind of popped up from friends that are texting me as they watch. Do you mind if we just do one quick?
Absolutely, it's my pleasure, and you're far too kind. I think the only things that I know I've had to learn the hard way, as we all learn new skills when we're confronted with challenges, which I think is a very valuable metaphor for what everyone's going through right now, starting with having to learn how to use Zoom.
Yeah, I had somebody ask while we're talking about the terroir if you found some ancient varietals by surprise when you were kind of sifting through the land.
That would have been so exciting, and it is certainly part of the medium-term plan to do a bit of exploration on using unusual varietals there. The vineyard was planted with very old Grenache and Syrah, and my husband was the first one because, again, he knew so much more than I did, and his brother-in-law and sister-in-law are also very knowledgeable, and I was the rookie. And he wondered, wait a minute, with this altitude, why wouldn't it be a good place for white wine? And at the time, everybody was laughing at that because in the Southern Rhone, it's very hard to get the elegance and finesse of the Northern Rhone in the whites. And so he decided to try it anyway. And he's very good that way. He's quite the contrarian when the logic doesn't make sense. And I'm always the one needing validation, doubting myself, wondering if this is the right use of all our time and energy and resources. And he's more courageous about some of those decisions. So he planted a bunch of whites, and we were very, very excited about the results. And now that we understand more about how unusual the environment is, we are looking to other regions that also work with soils that are very poor and dry like ours, but at altitude. So we did a wonderful chain with all the wonderful specialists that we work with, experts, to try to come up with the right varieties. So watch this space.
This is a nice segue into, I think Daniela had a question about the consultants that you work with, correct?
Yeah, right. So also you have Philippe Camby, which is a very famous consultant for Chateauneuf and now the Gigondas and all the region. Also the Bourguignon couple, which are the most, I guess, specialists in everything that's soil and organic life. But you also work with a consultant from Napa Valley. Is it, do they consult on every vintage? Do they consult on every a particular grape? How does it work?
Absolutely. I mean, we could never have done it without the help of the people that you mentioned. Philippe Camby has an iconic palate. He's one of the great Grenache specialists of the world, but he just has an extraordinary encyclopedic knowledge and understanding of the sensorial aspects of wine. And having him actually consult us to build the winery was a huge asset. In fact, I would recommend to anyone who has a wine project in mind to make sure that you ask a really world-class enologist for advice. Don't just go with the construction companies specialized in wineries and all of that. They'll never have the same sensitivities on how the work should be organized and where everything should go. So that was an incredible bonus. And we work very closely with one of his associates now, Thomas Huy, on the technical sides of what we do, which is very interesting for us. But Claude and Lydia Bourguignon, you may have heard, are the greatest soil experts in the world. They are the scientists specialized in the microbiology of soils. And they were banging on pots and pans 20 years ago in regions like Bordeaux that had really killed off their soils at the time to try to get them to change the management and wean themselves off chemicals. And at the time, they were not well received at all. Today, fortunately, Bordeaux has really turned a corner. And for the most part, certainly the great chateaus and a lot of others have now gone back to much more sustainable management styles. But Zelma Long is the woman that you're mentioning from Napa. Yeah. She is absolutely one of the most influential people in my life. She has been an incredible mentor to all of us. She's the grande dame of enology. I think she's the most famous female enologist in the world. She was first graduating class at UC Davis and chief winemaker at Mondavi for 10 years, was always associated with wineries that were very pioneering in their day. And of course, many of them, like Mondavi, are now classics, but they were very adventurous and had the guts to believe in the potential of Californian vineyards to make Grand Cru, something we all take for granted now. Somebody had to have that vision and that belief, and she was part of that original clan. So because she's known as a pioneer who's always venturing into the next areas, having her take an interest and in what we were doing and believe in us and recognize and validate the potential of those grapes to make Grand Cru quality wine was essential for me. But also as a human being, she is such an inspiration. And I think anyone, not just women in the wine world, but anybody who has the opportunity to spend a bit of time with her, it's a privilege. So very, very lucky. And I think in general, we've worked with a number of other people as well who have collaborated on projects, people like Paul Pontanier, the famous iconic winemaker from Chateau Margaux, Alain Graillot, one of the great masters of Syrah in the Northern Rhone. Why would these people pay attention to this little vineyard? Certainly not because they don't have other things to do with their time. I think the exciting thing for them is to be in a place that's very experimental, almost like a wine lab, where they don't have to limit themselves to the rules and regulations that typically come very heavy-handed in some of the more established regions, especially in France.
Right, because you are in the Ventoux region, right, which is considered more like a satellite, not part of the Cru. So I guess there's maybe a little bit more flexibility within the appellation laws that maybe allows you for more experimentation and focus, especially on the privileged side that you're in. And my other question, which I think it's fantastic, we're gonna be drinking the Abelard 2011. Which is also the current release with the Eloise. And me as a consumer and as a buyer, I find it fantastic to be able to have these old vintages in the market at a fairly well priced. You know, it still shows the potential of the wine. But what is this late release philosophy that you guys have? Because it's 9 years, right? And I don't have to sell it. And I know the wine, we tasted it before with Ali, and it has this beautiful age potential, but because of the way it's worked, drinkability right now, it's also at a fantastic point. It's not aggressive, but it can hold up.
I think a lot of that came from two things coming together. First, the style of the grapes really lends itself to a vinification that is built to last. We have a good natural tannic structure in the grapes. We have a lot of thick skins packed with phenolic agents, flavor agents, which have to do with these soils that we talked about. And because of the altitude, an important characteristic of our grapes is that the concentration tends to come from the wind rather than the sun. So what I mean by that is, you know that in Provence we have the famous Mistral wind, but at altitude we actually have 21 different winds. They all have different names. And so they take a lot of the moisture out of the grapes and they leave this sticky juice, which is really fun to work with in the winery because it has a great texture, which you can then almost sculpt. You know, it's a bit metaphorical, but it feels that way. You're not just working with flavor, you're also working with texture. And so when you have grapes that have so much chutzpah, as we say in New York where I'm from, they tend to have a very exciting relationship with barrel aging. So if you're dealing with a lovely, gentle, soft / insipid Grenache like you might find in certain environments, very easy drinking, very pleasant, but a bit sort of on the flabbier side. It's very dangerous to put that kind of Grenache in an oak barrel. It will be overwhelmed by the oak and will be quickly sort of stinking of oak. So Grenache and oak have a difficult relationship. When you deal with this outlier Grenache, with this sort of old vines and very concentrated Grenache, it's the opposite. It loves its oak. It really interacts in a very special way with it. And then you have a high altitude mountain Syrah, which is much more like a northern Rhone style in terms of austerity, structure, restraint, finesse. It's lacking a little bit sometimes in that lovely fleshiness that you typically get in some of the southern Syrahs, but it does give you really good structure. So you have all the elements from the start because of your vineyard to make wines that are built to last. But the problem is that when you're small and new and in a slightly unknown region and you don't have a track record as a winemaker, nobody in the trade wants to give you the benefit of the doubt. They want you to take your place to make cheap and cheery wines that are an imitation of a Côte du Rhône, which is an imitation of a Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and you should not start out with ambitions of making Grand Vin and, you know, Grand Cru, all of that. And so you're guilty until proven innocent. When you first put your wine in barrel, for the first couple of years, that oak is quite noticeable. It's not particularly integrated. You hope and believe that it will find its place and that your grapes will keep their fruit because of this fantastic structure in the juice. However, the people who buy your wine will not believe you until you show them that that is what happens when your wine's aged. So that was why we took this painful decision to put ourselves on this late release program so that we would bring the wines into the market just when they were entering their drinking period. Otherwise, people might not believe that they would have the capacity to keep their fruit as fresh as it tends to stay.
I just want to say, because there are people watching that don't understand what that entails, that's
Yes.
many, many years of cash flow. So I just want to like take 2 minutes to explain that to somebody.
Yes, it's horrible. Don't do it. No, it was very difficult for our family. My husband had to go back to work in another profession in order to give us the means to continue. It was, it was his dream to do all this, and then here he was having to do other stuff to pay for this very painful period when we were waiting for Abelard and Eloise, our two top reds, to come into their own and to release them in the market. So
is that maybe why Astrolabe comes to fill a little bit that gap? If we're talking about
yes, absolutely, it is there very much to fill that gap as an easier drinking wine. It doesn't have the barrel aging, so it doesn't need as long to integrate. It still tends to stay very fresh for a long time, which was not necessarily the plan when we made it. We thought we would just make a wine to release sooner and to help us bridge the gap on the cash flow. And to our delight, Astrolabe has, in our opinion, sort of over-delivered in that even though it's much less expensive and it's a wine that's released sooner, I personally find that it keeps its fruit quite well, and it also has nice spice, and it has some aging capacity that is surprising for a wine that doesn't have any oak aging. So yes, that is very much the idea.
Right, when you're working with trade, which is what I would do, I would have to go and present the wine to our clients. It's a nice middle point, because of course there's those people that'll take that, that leap and spend the $300-400 that the wine ends up being in a restaurant. But then Astrolabe is like a friendly little, try this out. Yeah, and it keeps the charm of all the other cuvées. we're gonna have to step into a tasting in a few moments, but there was one topic I think that we had discussed, or that we had wanted to discuss rather, and it was something about, did you want to talk a bit about natural wines or something along those lines? Did you want to go into that?
Yes, I just wanted to put out a word of sympathy for wine consumers who are serious about wine, want to know more, want to do the right thing. They're serious about the planet. They're serious about their health. They're trying to navigate this minefield of labels and definitions. You hear organic and biodynamic and natural and sustainable. You have all sorts of different certifying agencies. You have different countries with different definitions about what constitutes organic, whether you can or can't use certain levels of sulfur or not, and etc. And
it is a lot of information, isn't it?
That is, sorry?
It's a lot of information, isn't it?
It's a lot to ask a consumer to take on board. So basically, some people are not at all preoccupied with that. They just want something that tastes good and meets their price point and goes well with their lifestyle or their food or whatever it is. But those people are fewer and fewer. More and more people are starting to care about what they ingest and whether that's good for their health and whether it's sensible for the planet and it's sustainable. So I guess the thing that the wine trade and the producers need to do fast and well, is find a system for consumers to understand what they're buying. A lot of people think that natural wine is, just organic, or maybe it's sustainable. We know it's nothing to do with that. And I just wanted to say that I hope in the next few years that all of that will be a little bit more clear than it is. And in my case, I believe, having looked at all these different things, that sustainable winemaking is the best umbrella concept to go with, because by definition, if you're not organic or biodynamic or something like that in your vineyard, you're probably not going to be sustainable. And I believe it's wonderful to let the vines, thrive without these chemicals. However, in the winery, and this is perhaps a slightly more controversial point, I believe wines should be very crafted, very carefully looked after, a lot of hygiene, a lot of science, a lot of careful, deliberate winemaking. And that's where with the natural winemakers, I don't always see eye to eye about laissez-faire and just sort of putting it there and seeing what nature does, because you can get to certain situations of spoilage, etc. So I just thought interesting to get your consumers to start understanding these nuances, because
and I'll get back to you on that, what you just said about the spoilage, because I am by far not the best person to talk about natural wines, because I don't have enough knowledge to talk about that. There's some that I appreciate because there's beautiful examples, but
absolutely.
Natural wines, especially because we're transporting them right to Canada, which is it's not Europe that you can drive, right? So it takes a while, and then it's here because of the process, you get storage and that. So there's a higher risk of spoilage that when the wines get to the table or when the consumer opens them, they find that the wine, let's say it's faulty, but they think that's the signature and they get stuck on that. And I think that's dangerous, because there's no other way of explaining them than that's actually not the way it should taste. But so sometimes like a very closed mind, just maybe because of lack of knowledge, or sometimes, yes, it's fruity and it's drinkable. It's not very complex. So again, it's super fun to drink, but fun and funky, there's a limit to what's related to it. So.
Well, I'm just going to say it. I don't like a large part of them because I actually consider them to be quite faulted. And to what Nicole was saying, is like wine does have a very sensitive, like microbiological environment that does need tending to. So the laissez-faire attitude, if it works, then that's great, but it still has to be observed. And then if there does need to be an intervention, then you do have to intervene. And I think that having a philosophy of letting it be is what actually puts you in that box to create something not great. And then because they're so stuck on it being a natural wine, they're losing the wine, in my opinion. I mean, you know, I've tasted.
It's a style, because if you think about the art world, I love art, and some artists are incredibly deliberate in their structuring of their paintings, the mastery of their craft, and they want to control their medium a lot in order to control the outcome, and that's their way of expressing their vision for their art, and they see it as their responsibility as a visionary, but also a craftsperson, to express something and add something to nature with their own vision, their own interpretation, their own skill. And other artists, also great and fascinating, believe in a certain randomness. If you think of a Jackson Pollock, or you know, people who have in the contemporary art world, who often let randomness be one of the contributing factors to the final outcome of the artwork. And so it's very personal. I'm just saying that my philosophy of wines that I like are ones that withstand the test of time. I think that's one of the toughest judges and the hardest to have as your master. And I just don't know how many natural wines will be able to age effectively. And I think if they can, then I'm all for it.
Yeah, that was very beautifully said. So one last question. I'm scared that this one will take a bit longer than we want it to, but we're going to go for it. I have somebody, or a few people, who are asking about the big elephant in the room, and that's how COVID is affecting things for, as far as doing business for wineries. I mean, I'll give that for the moment. I don't know how comfortable you feel like, but everyone.
I'll try to cry off camera. I'd say that it's quite fascinating to, in a bad way, unfortunately, to see how the first reports are coming back, just like we're getting all the medical information feeding in and collating now from around the world, and somebody's adding up all the cases and all that. We're seeing a little bit of the first information coming in from wineries and the trade. And I have the good fortune of having of chairing this organization that we founded. First it was the think tank Fine Minds for Fine Wines, and now the umbrella organization, the Arani Global Institute for the Future of Fine Wine. And we're having all these powwows, roundtables with people around the world, all bringing their science and their knowledge together. And the sad picture that is coming out of it, it seems, is that in the same way as the on-trade around the world has been and is continuing to be hit so hard, and the off-trade that really was developing hand in hand until this situation with the on-trade is in many cases benefiting from a lot of the panic buying and all the people, you know, the self-isolation. So some people are having sales results better than Christmas. Others are completely out of business and no idea how they're going to make it till the end of the month. And in the same way, unfortunately, it seems that one can make some early generalizations about this crisis really impacting small wineries so heavily around the world, and then bigger wineries that have commercial wines that sell mainly through supermarkets and that kind of distribution, those guys actually having very, very good sales numbers. So what one of the likely outcomes is that we will be in a pretty tragic situation for a lot of small wineries that are risking going out of business. We all have very high fixed costs because the vineyard work is oblivious to all these contractions in demand. We have a relationship with our staff, which is usually very much either family or like family. So we're not going to be doing mass layoffs and things like that, like you see in some other businesses that are quickly re-engineering for the slump. And also, we don't have margins or cash flow on our side of the business. Many people are in it for passion, for obsession, as in our case. And so we don't have the resources. So those resources are going to have to come either from personal savings and other projects that were not intended to be plugging the hole, or from perhaps the government, but unlikely because we don't have much representation as a strategic business to our governments. And so I would say, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of many, many small winemakers around the world, that if in this crisis you do want to enjoy some wine at parity of quality, style, and price point, if you have the opportunity to drink wines from small winemakers right now and help them keep their head above water until the storm passes, I think they will be very, very grateful to you.
Yeah, and every bottle counts, everyone watching.
I just have one last question before we pass to the tasting. Nicole, I know you're very involved with the Grenache Association and South of France. Just to there's like a Grenache Day, and you're developing the branding of it worldwide. Could you please explain me a little bit more what you're doing with Grenache?
I think when you start in a new field and you don't have the expertise, but also you don't have the preconceived notions that some other people might have from being there, you're more likely to be able to ask some of those elephant in the room questions. And one of the things that really struck me was, wait a minute, how is it possible that Grenache is the most widely planted red grape in the world? You may know that there are about 360,000 hectares of Grenache and only about 120 or so, perhaps 160 now, thousand hectares of Cabernet, for example. And yet, if you ask people what are the top red grapes, you'll hear, of course, Cab, of course, Syrah, sometimes Pinot, Merlot, you might even hear Malbec, but somehow Grenache was never on that list. And we started asking ourselves how that might be. And in a lovely conversation one night with Steven Spurrier, he said, well, you know, you have to right this wrong. You have to figure out why that is, and help Grenache have its place at the table in the Olympus of great red wines of the world. There's wonderful white Grenache, there's Grenache Gris, and all sorts of other good Grenaches as well. But so we said, well, let's get a few people together. And I used to be director of programs in a think tank. And when we didn't know what to do with a big problem, we would get the right people, the right questions, and try to find the answers. And okay, why don't we get 10, 12, maybe 20 people? Well, before we know it, we had 270 people from 23 countries showing up at our vineyard in my first year of releasing wine. I almost ended up in the hospital, but it was a dream come true. It was a bit like that cheesy baseball movie with Kevin Costner, you know, Field of Dreams or whatever. Yeah. If you build it, they will come. To see these iconic winemakers come from all over the world with these extraordinary Grenaches and break bread for 3 days to try to understand what was so special about Grenache, that they loved it so much, and what consumers needed to know and learn in order to appreciate it better. And from that, all sorts of initiatives came: the Grenache Symposium, the Grenache Association, Grenache Day, Grenache Night, Grenache Tattoo, you name it, we have it. Yeah. So the good news is that Grenache has now officially gone from 12th most recognized red grape in the world to number 5. So we do feel or hope that we've done our little part to
I imagine, because there's so many beautiful expressions. If I can, the first 3 that come to my mind will be in the region, you know, Rayas, which is a like 100% Grenache. And also Australia has very, very, very old vines, like 1850s for when everybody got colonized, and Sardinia or south of Italy, Spain, of course. So it's amazing that, congratulations.
I wouldn't do it again. It was, it's called biting off more than you can chew and figuring out how you're going to chew it. But everybody has to do those kinds of things at least a few times in their life, because that's how you change things.
Great. So Annie, you want to do testing right now?
Yes,
With
please.
pleasure.
Okay.
Well, I've been sipping on the Viognier. We have the 2017. I'm excited. This is the first time we've had the Viognier in our market. We focused on the Abelard and Eloise our first few years. So we have Viognier, Astrolabe, and both the Astrolabe and Eloise. So I think we're going to just do Abelard today, and we'll talk about Eloise. But if you want, Daniela has
I'm gonna like just try to put them like this.
the best tasting descriptions ever. She's like a Baudelaire of
Oh, I'm impressed.
here. So I think I'm just gonna step aside and let my girl take it from here.
Oh yeah, no, of course, yeah. We were discussing before this what I really enjoy about this Viognier. You know, it's very high on well, the monoterpenes. You know, this very aromatic, this orange blossom and lilies, and you have that lime, lemon, zest, juice, apricot, honeydew, but also on that very aromatic herbs, as in Thai basil is a bit of lemongrass, and we get that on the mouth, especially because you know Viognier can get very really oily and heavy, but here it does have that oily texture, but I think it's lifted also because of the herb aspect that comes refresh the mouth without being an acidic note, but the greenness that comes balance it out. And I like that at the end it has that a touch of bitterness in the aftertaste, but it's just wants me to take another sip, right? It just keeps on balancing, and the drinking and swallowing at the same time. It's a very nice circle to have, very dangerous circle to have.
Lovely, lovely descriptors. Thank you. It's an honor to have wines drunk by people who really pick up on all the nuances, because that's something that I'm so passionate about. And anyone who's looked at our labels will see that they're very intricate and they have layer on layer of detail. And there are actually 50 different symbols that are in there. And I deliberately tried to build it in a way that you would have, you know, very obvious things like Chêne Bleu, the blue oak, and then you'd start noticing more and more. And I hope that that's exactly what happens to you when you try our wines, because they were crafted to try to do exactly that. So what I mean is that for me, a well-structured wine is a wine that immediately says something to you about the fruit, about the place, but then as you go deeper into it, you get different layers that don't jump out at you immediately. And what I mean, especially for the oak, all our wines are oaked except for Astrolabe, and in some cases quite significantly. And this one has spent 7 months in demi-muit. We used to use the full barrels, but the reason for that is that it allows us to structure and roll out for you all these different layers of flavor that you were talking about. One of the things that we were very excited about making a Viognier in this place was that we love the Northern Rhone Viogniers, but all our white wines have this strange duality, which I believe is a bit hard to come by, which is that if you look at them in the light, you'll see those big sticky legs of glycerol. You'll see the texture that kind of sticks to the side of your glass, and we slightly honeyed colored, and you'll think, okay, all right, Southern Rhone Viognier, likely to be hot and cloying exactly as you described it, that oiliness and the weight. And then to kind of absolutely juxtapose those expectations with something that leaps out at you that's not at all what you were expecting, I hope, and have elegance and finesse on the aromatics, and have brightness, freshness, and a little bit of that searing acidity that carries through, which is very hard to come by in a hot climate. So we're trying to have the big fat fruit, this lean, clean freshness that comes through, and that the weightiness offset by a lightness at the same time. So 1 foot in the Southern Rhone, 1 foot in the Northern Rhone in terms of its style, and hopefully that giving it a style that's not really a carbon copy of either the Northern Rhone or the Southern Rhone Viogniers. You mentioned the honey, the fruits. I thought that was absolutely the apricot. Thank you for picking up on all that. One of the things about this wine that I find a bit surprising to me, and I hope that you taste the same things, because of course it's so personal, but pretty much every vintage of our Viognier has what we in French would refer to as a kind of as brioche, you know, like brioche. That's this very distinctive form of warmth, but not, it's, I don't really know how you would call it if you don't call it brioche. So,
well, I had on my tasting note, I had like pastry or apricot yogurt.
oh, thank you.
Somewhere
Thank
there.
you.
Does that come from, I guess, do you do a partial malolactic or a lee steering?
Yes, always, and well, always. It's hard to speak for every vintage, but typically we would do that, and we are very excited that this little Viognier also lasts quite long, because it's part of the prêt-à-porter part of the range, right? We have two parts. We have few wines as prêt-à-porter at a friendlier price point, and that are more crowd pleasers, more approachable from a cost point of view. And then we have our haute couture, tiny production, and very crafted, as we spoke about. And so I'm hoping that even though it's at this friendlier price point, it over delivers on its complexity and its ageability.
Yeah. And I like the, sorry, I like the mixing textures of the oiliness and the slight grippiness of
Yes.
the mouth that comes cutting, because it's neither one or the other, but it grounds it down, right? It's like it's not, it doesn't make it slippery. Let's say that sometimes the Viognier can go a little bit too much.
And this is very strange. I've never thought this when I've been nosing at Viognier, but I can actually smell the weight of it. Does that make any sense whatsoever? It's like
That's a lovely concept. I like that. I like anything that has juxtaposition, tension, contradiction, surprise, and it's just not cookie cutter, and always catching you a little bit off guard to get your attention, because Hugh Johnson has a wonderful definition for fine wine, which is fine wine is a wine worth talking about. And when we created the Fine Wines think tank, one of the things that we felt responsible for doing is try to bring a definition to what is fine wine. And we quickly realized that was such a quagmire, because everyone will have their own take on that. It's like trying to define art. And so we have decided to create more of a hologram of a definition. But if you needed something short and effective to ask yourself, is this a fine wine? I think that's a useful definition to keep in your pocket. And so this one, for me, the first thing that happens when you see sticky legs on the side of your glass like that is you get to think of a four-letter word that starts with F, which of course is food. And when you have a wine like this, although you can sip it with your friends, I think it calls out for some kind of food pairing to fully enjoy that texture that comes with it. Because at an aperitif, you can also have the lighter wines, the refreshing whites. You don't need to have the weight in the palate. So we personally, I like it a lot with poultry. This evening I had it with a lovely poultry dish with chicken with some olives and onions and a nice little sauce, and it was just such a great, the textures were perfectly matched, and it was just a really good combination.
Wonderful. So we have, I think we have less than, well, we have 11 minutes on the clock. I don't know. I'm not sure if it cuts us off. I still haven't sorted that out. But we're going to go through, we'll do Astrolabe real quick, and then we'll spend a bit more time, if you don't mind, on the Abelard. So Astrolabe, we're tasting the
15.
Correct. Thank you, Daniela. Yeah.
And this
So
is at 75% Grenache and Syrah, right?
the rest is Syrah, that's right.
And
So
do you ferment, do you co-ferment them, or do you blend them after? How does it work?
we blend all our reds afterwards, after the élevage. Because we have a long élevage, for Abelard and Eloise, we wait until the élevage is finished. Of course, in the case of Astrolabe, it's much quicker, but we prefer to do what we call precision winemaking, which is micro vinifications in small tanks. I didn't show you the winery, but we gave ourselves one big luxury, which is instead of having a few big tanks, to have lots of small tanks in many different types. We have concrete, stainless steel, wood, and that allows us to have a lot of precision with each mini block. And then the barrel room, of course, we have many different barrel producers, and it's a lot of work to manage all that. So to your point, oh, I didn't show you my sheet. To your point, I would say that we've tried co-fermenting, and the only thing that we co-ferment today is our whites. We tried co-fermenting the Viognier with the Syrah and in our Eloise blend, and that kind of removed a lot of the pop of the Viognier. So we've kind of gone full circle, and we don't do much of that now. So Astrolabe is designed to be the baby in the family. You can see here in his label, which is a little bit different from the all the other labels that we have. But it's the story of Abelard and Eloise, who had this extraordinary love affair in the 11th century in Paris. And he was the greatest thinker of his time. She was his disciple, half his age, very brilliant, went down in history as the smartest woman in France of her time, philosopher, and incredible life story. But it all goes pear-shaped. They're having their illicit affair. She gets pregnant. He gets punished very severely. I'll skip the details here. You can look it up on our website or elsewhere.
You're saying part two, because there's so
much gossip going on. Yeah.
Exactly. And so in their separation, they end up writing famous letters to each other until the end of their lives. And in fact, on the label, you can see they're Skyping instead, or maybe it's a Zoom call like us. But the idea is that they were the original self-isolators. For 27 years, they didn't see each other, and remained faithful. And so their son, Astrolabe, is born at the abbey, never meets his father. And here you see him as a young man, because when I was designing this, I thought this is, even though it's the youngest wine, it's not really a baby wine. For me, it makes me think of a young man. It has verve, it has some lean muscle to it, some nice spice, and some spunk. Whereas Abelard and Eloise, you're looking for gravitas or mellowed flavors. For me, it has a nice pop, which makes it a nice wine for Thursday night bolognese. You can really pair it, because it's a Grenache base, with lots of Mediterranean flavors and foods, a lot of Italian food, a lot of easy charcuterie, all of that. It's a very practical wine.
And as you say, it's the sun. It was very easy because the aromas and flavors are very precise and clearly, they show itself very clearly. So you have the red cherries and the other strawberries from the Grenache, but you also have that it has some age, so a touch of leather and dry meat and pepper from the Syrah. It's just very nice, integrated, and I guess it grounds it down, and it shows the terroir, because I picked up a bit of that garrigue, a bit dry rosemary and thyme, which also gives aromatics and opens up the wine and makes it friendly too. So it's very,
Very
you say it's the
impressive, young
sun.
lady. Very impressive. You know,
Thank
because
you.
the vegetation that often gets overlooked, and one reason, of course, if you're using lots of chemicals, all those nuances can be lost in the transmission of the terroir. We have a very particular vegetation, which is that all the garrigue, like you mentioned, the thyme, the rosemary, all those lovely essential oils and very dense aromatics. And then because we're so high up, we have the apparition of these mountain trees like pines. And of course, we associate with those vegetations the very clean, lean resin, air freshener, all of that. Again, that tension, the contradiction between big and fat, lean and mean. And I think Astrolabe has a bit of that duality, which are really making me very happy by picking up on. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's definitely quite complex as well.
Yeah.
The idea was for it to punch above its weight. I don't know if you've ever taken Virgin Atlantic, but I'm a big fan, or certainly used to be. I haven't had the chance to fly them in a while, but they have this fabulous philosophy of trying to figure out what your expectations are in a certain class of service and a certain price point, and to tick all the boxes with their basics, but then give you that little 15% more that you would normally get in the next level up of cost. And our desire for Astrolabe was to do exactly that. Start out with a classic Southern Rhone blend, Grenache Syrah, nothing original, and yet still for that same typical price point, hopefully over-deliver in terms of complexity, spice, and capacity to age.
Yeah, it does, and it picks up with the where you have primary, secondary, and tertiary characters. Again, the fruit is there, the garlic, but then you have that get this leather, this meat, but again you have flowers. So it's a whole. It's one step here and one step into the future, right? It's not going there, but it's between both of them.
Well, I must compliment you on your palate, because the 25% that's coming from Syrah is actually what's giving it that leatheriness and giving it that, it's very much that Southern Rose here. We're not going to be trying our Eloise tonight, the Northern Rhone, excuse me. But it is all about green peppers. It's not fleshy, and it has mainly savory notes, and that is very much what you're picking up on, I think, in the Astrolabe.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
You wanna do the Abelard, Alex?
Yeah,
I
can't imagine that Zoom cuts us off. I mean, it's a polite, streaming service, I would assume. So for people watching, I can't imagine we're going to get cut off, but if it does, it was not the intention, and we'll just keep filming, and then I'll definitely send it after, which is what the main plan for this video is. But I am definitely happy to step into the tasting of Abelard, and we have the 2011 that just landed in our market about a month ago.
Great.
Yeah, very exciting.
Yes, our current release. So this was a really lovely vintage. It was a very easy, enjoyable vintage to work with in the winery. Not all vintages let you express what you set out to express, a bit like children. Some come with very strong personalities, and you just spend your whole time trying to keep them from getting out of control. And then other times, some vintages are very, very pleasant to work with, and it was the case in 2011. So in fact, Abelard is the most concentrated wine that we make. Abelard and Eloise are supposed to express the two faces of our vineyard. Eloise was the Northern Rhone homage with the Syrah base, a bit of Grenache and a little splash of a white wine. Abelard is all about Grenache. You may remember that Grenache is the king of the Southern Rhone, Syrah is the queen of the Northern Rhone. So as you go up and down the Rhone Valley, you tend to find more of one or more of the other because they're more suited to different climates. But because we have 1 foot in each, we thought this was a perfect way to manifest the duality of our vineyard between north and south. So this is our Southern Rhone blend, and our Grenache is very much a mountain, muscular, and I would say masculine Grenache, not the softer, gentler one that you might find in other parts of France and the world. And so for that, we kind of let it show off its brawn. It's 85% Grenache on this vintage. Sometimes that drops to about 80%. Once in a while, it's gone up to 90. But we think that having this outlier Grenache, it's an opportunity to really let it express itself with these very particular small, dense grapes that we have. I hope you're getting a little bit of that black cherry. I'll be very interested to know what you smell in this wine. But I love the mix of plum, licorice, spices. And I think it's a very enjoyable wine to have with things that are very concentrated flavors. I like to say Abelard likes fur and Eloise likes feathers. When I say fur, I mean gamey, salty, even greasy, spicy, smoky, all of those descriptors of foods that really need a wine to stand up to that full flavor, but not overwhelm it. So that's what I'm trying to achieve here.
It's beautiful. There are so many things to say about this wine. First of all, the aromatics, but also the density, the concentration, and the depth that it's shown both in the nose and in the mouth. I think everything is showing beautifully and very much aligned, as there's that blend of black and blue and red plums kind of enveloping everything. I have like a lot of roasted coffee beans or cacao nibs almost in the nose and the texture as well. And of course, licorice, black pepper, again, garlic, cement, I want to say more like crushed rocks. And again, on the tertiary, I think it's beautiful. I put beef broth.
Very savory, yes, very
the smoked meat is there, the tobacco, the gamey, and also I think the baking spices. So it's just, there's a very, I don't want to say masculine, but I'm going to say a very masculine, side. But it's toned down with this very, again, feminine, again, the sweet spices, the pureness and the ripeness of the fruit that combines with the bitterness that the cacao and the coffee can bring, but just integrated, it's just, it increased the age potential and the how serious this wine is at the same time.
I also get a lot of that concentration that you would get from like a black olive, like that very
like a balsamic notes on that.
Yeah, that, but it's like this reduced, very intense flavor that is like really rewarding as well. It's like
that's our Syrah, absolutely characteristic. That black Syrah, the black olive is coming from the Syrah, which is why we like to have that. I think I like the fact that in America people are often moving now more towards blends, because I think you do miss out if you stick purely to single variety wines all the time. You're missing out on some of the tricks of the trade, and having the opportunity to play around with a whole other palette of flavors and add to the dimensions of the wine through blending is one of the great joys for winemakers. So I hope that as America continues to develop its sophistication with wine knowledge, it will continue down that path. And I think Canada is a lovely compromise, because you have this mix of cultural influences, the best of several worlds. And I do love Quebec and Montreal in particular. As Alexandra knows, we have family there. My husband's uncle lives there, and the culture has done such a great job of creating a fusion between many different influences. And I hope that that's very similar to what we're trying to do at Chêne Bleu, is to take the the best of many different traditions, many different ideas from other parts of the world, and blend them all together into a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. You may have seen our label has these this inscription at the bottom with our motto, which is non mihi non tibi sed nobis, not mine, not yours, but ours. And it is a reflection of a belief system that nobody has all the answers, nobody doesn't make mistakes, everyone can learn from each other, everyone can bring something new and special to this wonderful world of wine.
For sure. Nicole, I also wanted to mention the quality of the tannins, because we feel them way more than we feel them in Astrolabe, that we didn't talk about it, but how ripe and almost plushy there is. There's a very elegant grippiness, but that makes me, for a wine so concentrated like that, I would have expected something more rough, let's say, but it's so smooth and silky and elegant that it's, again, it has the longest aging potential, but right now it feels, I don't need to have a very big steak with that. I'm having this by the glass, and it's extremely enjoyable.
Well, I'm so touched by your comments, Daniela. We're meeting today for the first time, and yet it feels like the validation of the last very challenging 15 years of my life, to be speaking to someone halfway around the world that I'm just meeting, and have her not just appreciate this wine, but actually taste all the things that
thank you
I would wish for someone to taste. And that was the whole point of going to all that trouble, is to infuse these wines with all those dimensions of flavors. And here you are reading these wines so beautifully. I'm very touched.
It's the second time we've met, and why I love your rosé is because it's the first one that I tried last year at Texan. You were the first table. Yes. You were so encouraging, pouring to everybody, and I was like, "What is this rosé? This is so good." Which we don't have right now to taste, but I think Ali has a small allocation. Which
yes, our rosé is definitely an important member of the family, because it's a bit of an anti-rosé rosé. It's a rosé for people. Sorry, with these funny screen things. That is for people who don't think they like rosé. Usually, they're saying that they don't like wines that, although they make a lovely first impression, don't have follow-through, complexity, structure, balance, minerality, ageability, etc. And so to try to keep a pretty first impression on a rosé, but then put back in all the stuff that's often missing, that took us many years. It took us about 6 or 7 years of R&D, and my brother-in-law, who's such a brilliant winemaker, he really cut his teeth on that. And the clincher was finding finally a way to fine it with something other than what everyone uses, which is this PVPP. Is a petrochemical derivative, and it gives this little bitter aftertaste. And to be able to fine it with ground organic green pea powder, and see that smooth, soft landing on the tail instead of that bitter finish, that was just a big moment in our little winery. So I'm glad you appreciate it.
You're running it through like a mesh with that as the barrier, or?
No, you use it the way you use all the other fining methods. You just mix it. It's not the filtering. It's the big molecules that you use to pull down all the flotsam and jetsam that's been fermenting, because these direct press rosés are very, very wonderful, because you get to do 5 weeks of cold fermentation with all the lees and all the flotsam and jetsam that you get from the little indigenous yeast, everything that's floating around in there, and that's what gives it texture and flavor. But then you have to remove all that, because your rosé is very opaque, and so to fine it, it's very common in rosé to use this PVPP, because you don't want to use egg albumin or any of the animal fining agents, because the animal proteins will often leave a flavor that's too heavy for a white or a rosé. And so being able to find this wonderful organic pea powder was very exciting. It's very expensive to use, but we think it's one of the many reasons why the wines taste better and age better.
But also in your rosé, we have old vines, right? It's also that brings
Yes,
extra
only old vines.
complexity. That it's very, again, it's very rare to find.
Yeah.
Yes, old vine rosé. Actually, all the reds are old vines. The some of the whites that we put in the rosé, little splash of Vermentino, for example. That's that is unusual thing, but I recommend it because in a hot year like 2017, for example, very hot year, so hard to make a white wine like this Viognier or rosé in a year like that. It's very tempting to have to resort to the tartric acid, and by upping the amount of Vermentino, you can make the wine fresher in a hot year without having to add in chemicals. So our typical Vermentino would be about 5%. And in 2017, for example, we brought it up to 17%, 12%. But that was quite exceptional. So again, I think it's so important to have a lot of tools at your disposal, a lot of different grapes in your vineyard, a lot of different tanks, and a lot of different styles of tanks, because all of these things allow you to make fine wine without having recourse to any artifice.
Incredible.
We're excited to try them whenever they come, Ali.
Well,
It's so lovely.
Now we're also having our own little COVID issues, so
Sure.
you're in the pipeline, and we're very, 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 very excited. And I have to say that it's very difficult to sell rosé in our market because the SAQ bombards, the offering during the pool season, and we have a very funny view of as evolved as like the Quebec palate can be. Rosé, I think Daniela would agree, is like I'm going to the pool, let me have some rosé. And so I'm actually really excited to introduce a more serious and proper offering of rosé, because I think rosé is a really incredible food pairing wine as well. That is like
with every seafood that you have.
Yeah.
Every cold seafood, everything that's tartare, carpaccio, cold things,
as well as grilled, like it can really cling on to that char flavor as well. So I'm really excited about it, I have to say.
Well, I think people are, as the category has expanded so much so fast, now you have so many people who were clumping all rosés together and starting to understand that actually it's breaking down into subcategories. So you have the ones for the pool, and you have on the other end of the spectrum gastronomic rosés, which we often call winter rosés, because you can drink them all year round. Not as cold as traditional rosé. You don't have to have the frosty glass because of the structure of the wine is very complete. The frosty glass is great to hide faults, but if it's well structured, then on the contrary, you can drink it just chilled. Doesn't have to be freezing temperature, and that allows you to have a food wine that pairs particularly well with many composite flavors. So if you order a lot of international foods of traditions where they have many flavors all at once, like Lebanese, many of the Asian cuisines, or potluck, and you want, or buffet, you need one wine that's going to slot in aromatically with a broad spectrum of flavor styles. Then these kinds of food rosés can be very useful and make a lot of people happy. So hopefully you'll be seeing more and more of this, and people will understand that in their cellar they can have 4 or 5 different rosés for different types of occasions.
Right, and that rosé can age as well.
Yes, absolutely true.
Perfect.
Great, ladies, this has been fascinating. I really always enjoy talking to Nicole, and thank you, Daniela. You just add such a strong component to these chats. And I'm sad that we had to, you know, step into this Zoom area to have these meetings, but I'm starting to have a lot of fun. And, you know, I think that moving forward, we're gonna do a lot more of these. And I thank you for taking the time. I know it's a bit late where you are, so
I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan, and Daniela, you're a tasting superstar, and I think that between you two ladies, the Canadian market doesn't stand a chance. There's going to be a lot of exciting wine being sold, and I'm so happy, because when I started in the wine world a few years ago, people said, "Ooh, forget Canada, SAQ, they just want big volume wines at low prices, and there's no place for little wineries and little boutiques with special things that are a bit unique and different." And I'm so happy that you're proving that wrong, and working hard to bring unusual things to lovely people. So good on you. And I hope that anyone who does take the time to try these wines, please make a moment to participate in our bunny hunt. It's part of our tradition. You'll notice that in all our labels, there are little white rabbits that are hiding. You might see some in the image behind me.
Yeah.
With those, with the little rabbits there. There are about 3 on the Astrolabe label. There are 5 on our Abelard and Viognier labels, and they're very hard to find. But anyone who finds them all becomes a member of the International Bunny Club. You get a little prize, and it's my way of thanking you for taking the time to pay attention to this little vineyard that's very remote and very new, and working very hard to try to punch above its weight. And it means a lot to me that you would make your time to get to know these wines. So do look for your bunnies. They are a symbol for all the work that we do to manage the ecosystem. They're halfway between the big predators and the small animals, and they're a quick way, by counting the bunnies, to check that the ecosystem is working properly. So I think they tie straight into all the work that we're doing on the sustainability front. So I hope you will be in touch with us, and if you do come to France, please come visit us, and we'll try to make your visit very worthwhile.
For sure.
Yeah, we
Thank
didn't
you so much, Nicole.
touch on the property, but that's also a whole other episode. Yeah, what a place. I'll definitely share all of that information when I send out the video. And I just wanted to say, because Caroline is watching, but she couldn't be on screen with us.
Caroline, congratulations.
We're such proud ambassadors, and really grateful to have partners like you in our portfolio. So thank you.
Well, you're wonderful. Thank you very much. And please keep in touch, and do look out for small producers right now. You'll be doing them a great favor.
Absolutely. We're going to be here, that's for sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Have a good evening.
Bye. Thank you. Same to you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.